Hello, and welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle, Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. There are some topics in American politics that generate both passion and boredom. Many Americans have profound passions about the amount of taxes that they pay, but if you want to end a conversation at a party quickly, talk to them about the intricacies of tax law. Civil-military relations is another one of those topics. Many Americans have strong views about the military, and although its popularity and confidence has slipped in recent years, Americans strongly support the military as an institution and as individuals. And yet, if you want to engage Americans in discussions about the intricacies of civil-military relations, oftentimes their eyes will wander and their attention will focus elsewhere. Fortunately, this week we have assembled a panel of extraordinary experts and scholars who have devoted their attention and focus to the questions of civil-military relations. And I'll ask them each to introduce themselves, and I'll begin with you, Alice.
Hi, I'm Alice Friend. I'm the VP for Research and Analysis at the Institute for Security and Technology, which is based on the West Coast, although I am not. I've worked at the Pentagon a couple of times, and I'm nearing completion on a book about civilians and civil-military relations. I hope.
Excellent. Ron?
My name is Ron Krebs. I'm a professor of political science at the University of Minnesota, where I'm also the editor of the journal Security Studies. And I've written on a bunch of things, but including my started with fighting for rights, military service, and the politics of citizenship, but the relationship between military and society. And I've been spending the last few years working on questions of public opinion on civil-military relations and its consequences.
Excellent. And Risa?
I'm Risa Brooks. I teach at Marquette University in Wisconsin, and I have been working on civil-military relations for a very long time. And fortunately, it's become a lot more exciting over time. I both study the U.S. and also look at other countries, including some in the Middle East. And I've been working on a variety of topics, and I might mention some of those today. We'll see.
Great. Well, it's a great pleasure to have all of you here. You're each folks whose writings have provoked a great deal of thought as I've looked at these questions, and I'm really excited about the conversation that we're going to have. In order to set some context, about 6 weeks ago, on September 6th, our sister publication, War on the Rocks, published an unprecedented letter. It was signed by all but one of the living Secretaries of Defense and all but one of the living Chairmen of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, I should say former Secretaries of Defense and former Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and it laid out basic principles of American civil-military relations. I would say that this is unprecedented both because of who participated, but also the topic. I think for many years, Americans tended to regard civil-military relations almost as a luxury good. We were hand-wring about questions having to do with things at the margins, about agreement about social policies or things like that. And yet this letter addressed fundamental questions that had to do with how, when, and why the military must obey the orders of civilians and follow their guidance in questions on the use of force. And so, Ron, I'd like to begin with you. I'd like to talk about the significance of that letter, why it happened, and what you see as the major issues that were surfaced. And was this something that was necessary?
So I think all of us are aware, even the your prototypical American who has chosen to put his head in the sand like an ostrich when it comes to civil-military relations, has known that since 2016, since the election of 2016, something has been afoot. Donald Trump enters the Oval Office, first president in my increasingly long-in-the-tooth life, who starts talking about my generals, right, surrounding himself with the aura of the military. In a way that is more explicit and more clear than any president in my memory. And over the course of the next 4 years, there is incident after incident and episode after episode as those relationships begin to fall apart, as Trump seeks to bring the military in on his side, and as Trump in a variety of ways erodes those well-established norms of civil-military relations. And of course, this reaches an apex after the murder of George Floyd, when Donald Trump walks across Lafayette Square, flanked by General Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And General Milley then shortly thereafter, issues essentially a letter of apology saying that I was wrong to have done so. It's been an extraordinary time, right? When else have we seen presidents give speeches in front of members of the rank and file? We're wearing hats that are essentially represent their loyalty to that president. In this case, I'm referring to MAGA hats. So it's been an extraordinary moment. And there's been a lot of concern, of course, because of the ways in which Donald Trump and now well over half the Republicans who are running for offices in the federal government, as well as secretaries of state, have questioned the legitimacy of the count in the 2020 election. And so precisely that is the critical context in which this letter took shape, sparked in part by our friend and colleague Peter Feaver of Duke University, who thought it an opportune time to articulate those concerns about, articulate sort of consensus principles of civil-military relations. I imagine we will spend some time talking about what the letter is missing, but I think that's probably all you wanted me to say for now, Doyle.
Sure. Risa, what are your thoughts on this?
Sure. So I think I'm a little less certain about what the intent of the letter really was. But first, let me say, I think that whenever senior officials, both military and civilian, talk about civilian control, it's a good thing in my book. And so I applaud them for doing that. And I think it must have gone beyond their comfort zone a bit for some of them, especially the former chairman, to do this. But I think as I reflected on it, I wondered, what is the problem that this letter is trying to solve? What is the plot here? And maybe it's the plot that Ron is laying out, or maybe not. As I started to think about it, what I sort of came to was that I think although it seems to be geared toward a military audience, it's really about civilians. It's really about what a message to civilians about the military's role in democratic politics, and to the military about civilians' role in democratic politics as well. Things like, what is the military's role in or not in an election, the importance of regular order and civilians abiding by regular order, and the role of the military in perpetuating that. Things like sort of talking about the military not being involved in law enforcement roles. And I think that that's an important message, and the context that Ron laid sort of provides the reason why signaling about what civilians' roles in relation to the military should be is important. But I also really wondered how far it went in actually helping military professionals to understand how to navigate the challenges of civilian politics today and civilian politicization. And maybe we can get into some of those themes later. But I really wondered, did it provide the tools that are necessary to deal with the challenges of the day while being a useful sort of intervention about civilian control and its importance?
So, Alice, you have some very recent experience working at very high levels within the Department of Defense. I'm very curious about your perspective when you saw this come out.
Yeah, when I first read the letter, I, like a lot of people, thought, this is a good list of the basic principles. And in a lot of ways, it really was a back to basics kind of piece, which I think has been a response, frankly, to the Trump era, which challenged so many of our norms that we thought we all shared across the country. And it turned out that a very significant number of Americans seemed not to. And certainly the president wasn't operating based on a lot of the norms. But I think we've gotten out of gotten to the other side of the Trump era and found that we haven't been able to sort of snap back into that shared sense of norms. And so pieces like this, I think, are there to reinforce those basics, which I think is good. I don't think, there's kind of no critique of the letter as itself that makes much sense to me. But when I was reading it, to just sort of continue what Risa was saying, I kept thinking about who the audience for this letter was. Right? It seemed to me to be a very military gaze, this letter. It seemed to me to really be addressing sort of concerns that come out of folks in uniform on how to handle this moment. And as I read it, I thought, if I'm a civilian reading this, like, what do I do with this? There aren't enough specifics here. And so what really struck me about the letter was like, yeah, we need to get back to basics, but those basics actually don't do much for us in our current moment. I mean, I think that's where we're stuck right now in civ-mil relations is we have all these nice old principles that for whatever reason are not resonating with people. And we've been repeating them for the last 6+ years, and it's just not sinking in. And so I think it's a real time for us to be introspective and ask ourselves, why aren't those things sinking in? And my preliminary answer is, well, actually, this doesn't help me. You know, when I was working on the secretary's corridor recently, you know, like, I should give legal orders. Sure, of course I should. But like, what does that mean, right? Like, how do I actually manage this relationship in a tactical way on a day-to-day basis? Like, I don't have a lot of a playbook for that.
Yeah, Risa.
I was just going to say, when I was thinking of it as an audience for civilians, I was thinking of it as an audience about not interfering with the military or using them in inappropriate ways. And I agree with you that the substance on how civilian control works is absent in that letter. And I think your War on the Rocks piece really addressed that. I would say it's not just the civilians that aren't getting good guidance or information from this primer, but it's also the military. I mean, so many things are legal. Like, what is left? Really egregious violations of human rights or things like that. Like, how much guidance and substance just following legal orders really provide, especially with the kind of challenges that the military is facing in terms of sort of pressures to get involved in politics or in other dimensions.
Yeah, I certainly agree with that. And, you know, I actually used a phrase that I borrowed from your namesake, Risa Brooks, and has been picked up by Bobby Chesney and Steve Vladeck on the National Security Law podcast of lawful but awful. And there's a whole range of activities that would not constitute a manifestly unlawful order. But boy, we'd be really upset if the military engaged in those activities. So the sense I'm getting from the discussion here is that this War on the Rocks open letter was important, but it was also sort of Civ-Mil 101. So since we have assembled literally graduate teachers of civil military relations, what I'd like to know from you guys is, what are the graduate level issues? What are the things that are out there that we ought to be concerned about that go past the basics? And Alice, maybe we could start with you on that one.
Oh, man. I mean, I think the most urgent issue in Civ-Mil right now is just our national political dysfunction, that Ron laid out quite well at the top of the podcast. The increasing tendency for the public to see the military as a partisan actor, and for politicians and other prominent civilian elites to involve the military in partisan struggles for power. That's the moment we're in. And I think that's what we need more tools for and more research to. Ron's been doing a lot of that research as well. Risa's come at it from the how military professionalism and the way we conceptualize it blinds the military to their political power and roles, and actually, perversely politicizes them more. But involving the military in our partisanship is sort of the logical conclusion to a world where neither civilians nor the military really grasp how politically powerful the military services are, and how a major element of the civilian role in civil military relations is to limit the military's partisan political autonomy. Sharon Weiner and I have a piece in TNSR right now that argues that civilians often defer to military advice because that's politically expedient for them to do so. But presidents and SASC chairs don't say to themselves, we want to cede political power to the military. They think, if I don't follow military advice, it will be politically costly to me. Those are the kinds of things, the kinds of debates I think we need to really open up.
Yeah, and I thought that was a terrific article. It built nicely on an earlier piece by Polina Belyakova. And I really appreciated the case studies that you guys brought in taking a look at the specific types of circumstances where the political risks of not deferring to military expertise are perceived as a cost that the politicians and civilian masters are unwilling to bear. I thought that was really terrifically well done, and I would commend that article to any of our listeners. Risa, Alice just mentioned a little bit about the military's perspective on these things, and some of the work you've done in the past couple of years, I think, has been a healthy corrective to some of the work of Samuel Huntington that just has a profound influence even on folks who've never read Huntington. And I'm wondering, in addition to whatever other issues you have, if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so definitely, I think your point about people who have never heard of Samuel Huntington, both civilians and military, understanding the appropriate relationship in terms of his so-called objective control model, or the idea that there should be a separation of spheres between the military and civilians. And at the top, it should be extremely transactional, with each sort of operating from their own lane. And I think that, sort of Alice touched on one of the implications of that, which is that it doesn't prepare the military very well for dealing with both sort of military activity. That's a bit of a different discussion, but on the train that we're on right now, for dealing with civilian politicization of the military. It doesn't give them a lot of tools. It sort of encourages a reflexive response, which is, I don't need to think about this. I don't need to pay attention. I just follow orders. And that can potentially enable sort of civilian politicization. I think Milley's walk across Lafayette Square is sort of a case study of that, right? According to his own account. And so I would say that what this current time requires, probably not just now, is a rethinking and re-understanding of what it means to be a military professional and what that requires for one's individual behavior and understanding of politics today.
Yeah, there are a couple of passages in Huntington that I think are a lot more provocative than people give them credit for. One is his sort of punchline that the answer is for the liberal society to become less liberal in order to accommodate the security imperative. But there is also a section somewhere, I believe, in about chapter 4, where he discusses the way in which he faults the German general staff in the 1930s for their opposition to a rising Adolf Hitler because it violated their professional sphere of expertise. And I'm always a little bit surprised that that doesn't get a lot more attention in terms of whether a view of spheres of expertise that has such a black and white perspective is one that can offer a helpful and healthy recipe for democratic civil-military relations. So, Ron, what other issues should we add to our list of fears as we're outlining all the things that are going wrong?
Well, I want to build on where Alice kicked us off, which is that I think the concerns about politicization with which I began and which Risa has really importantly put on the table are really great. I've long been concerned about deference to the military. This letter, as Alice rightly put it, has a military gaze, even if, as Risa said, the audience is really civilians. And it's the military saying, this is what we do. Don't ask to just any longer to do these things that you're not supposed to be asking us to do. But what they didn't say is, how should you civilians, aside from these don'ts, and maybe listening to us when you should, how should you be relating to us? And there's nothing there about the need for civilians not to be deferential. What do we mean by deference? Deference is replacing your judgment with that of another. And fundamentally, right, the problem is that, in fact, I'm going to disagree a little bit with Risa, only in a certain way, which is the fact is that the civilians have not read Huntington enough. Right? They have not read Huntington enough that it is fundamentally their responsibility to make policy. And if they read, and in fact, so we have the threat of politicization, but we also have the threat of deference. And what I found in my research is that people really don't intuitively grasp Huntington's core point. They are remarkably deferential to the military, not just because it's politically easy for them to do so and it's politically advantageous, but the general public simply doesn't buy into a kind of a folk theory of democracy, which is that civilians should fundamentally be in charge because they're accountable to us. They would rather seem to have major decisions. In our polling, about half of Americans would rather have major decisions about whether to use military force be made not by their elected officials, but rather be made by the military themselves. And that's a sort of a fundamental miss, right, with regard to who should make decisions in a democracy. And sort of the second thing that's really concerning, and this speaks to the politicization, is that I would actually be somehow reassured if conservatives were really deferential to the military and liberals were really not deferential to the military. But we, in fact, find that people's views of civil-military relations are fundamentally politicized. And it entirely depends on whether you think, how do you feel about that character in the Oval Office, right? So you may distrust the military, but you distrust Donald Trump even more if you're an extreme liberal back in 2019. And then in 2021, what we discovered is that after all of the Republican attacks on the woke military, Republicans essentially said to themselves, we don't like Joe Biden. But you know what else? Those guys in the military, we thought they were our allies. They're not, right? Stay in the barracks. We don't want you getting involved in public debates over policy. So I would be sort of more reassured at some level if it were about ideology, but it's not, right? In fact, their approach is is fundamentally rooted in politics in their sense of the military as a basically political actor, right? Fundamentally contrary to the Huntingtonian view. The other thing just to put on the table, we've spoken a lot about politicization. We've spoken about deference. What we haven't spoken about is something that scholars like Heidi Urban have paid a lot of attention to, which is an emerging sense, which we only have some data on, about how the military thinks about itself. That in some ways, all of our talk about how great the military is, that they're the most patriotic and the most professionally competent, they've drunk the Kool-Aid in a pretty serious way. And what are the implications of that for how they think of their own role in a democratic polity?
Yeah, there's a terrific article by Heidi and Susan Bryant and TNSR that outlines some interesting longitudinal data they have taking a look at cadets and at officers at the mid-career point in terms of the perspectives there. And I would once again commend that to all of our listeners. I guess just two quick things that I would engage with on your comments there, Ron. One is I was surprised when you said you don't think that the civilians have read Huntington enough, because my perspective coming from a career in the military was that the military reflexively had a Huntingtonian view of civil military relations, which was basically give me a mission and set me free. And that the civilians often reflexively had a view much more aligned with the theory of Peter Feaver, which focuses on the idea that oftentimes civilian policymakers in the military may have opposed interests, and that the role is to institute mechanisms in order to bring the military into line of what it is that the civilian policymakers want them to do. At times, I think Feaver's definition of what he calls shirking behavior is a little bit expansive. But, this sort of idea that fundamentally is the civilian's right to be wrong is at the heart of his theory, that it doesn't matter how bad the civilians are. The military's job is to carry out all legal orders and policy, which, is also consistent with Huntington, but consistent in a different way, because for Feaver, he's discussing it in the realm of things that are unwise and going into that background there.
Let me just clarify, right? We use the word civilian in very broad ways, but there are many different kinds of civilians. So obviously the political and the approach that you're describing, I think, is that of many in the executive branch, right? But obviously there is supposed to be a significant role for Congress when it comes to oversight. And there is where we see a lot of the deference. And I was also talking about the role of public opinion in general, right? Public opinion lurks in the background of every major theory of civil military relations. And it is the public that I was suggesting that really, both members of Congress and the public, that have really not drunk at the Huntingtonian fountain, if you will, right? And so my sense is that the public doesn't actually have it's rooted, that Huntingtonian conception, in ways that we don't always recognize, is rooted in a basic folk theory of democracy that in principle all democratic citizens should accept. But in my research, they simply don't seem to.
And the one other thing I'll offer before we go on to a topic that I know is near and dear to Alice's heart is, you've talked about the political aspects of it, and I would only offer the slight correction that I think what we're discussing here are the partisan political aspects of it, that the application of force for state purposes is inherently political. It can't be other than that. But the concern becomes when it is associated with faction domestically and contending domestic perspectives, not the political use of force for political ends in the way that we think of it in a Clausewitzian way. So, we've been talking around this question of what is the appropriate role for civilians? Where do they go to find their guidance? And on October 17th, Alice, you put out a terrific article on War on the Rocks that addressed precisely this question. Can you talk to us about this? First of all, what inspired you to do this, and what are your thoughts on it?
Well, what inspired me is, this sounds so self-serving, but I've been working on this research for a couple of years now to put it all in a book. And it's because, once upon a time, I was writing a dissertation on civil relations, trying to figure out where civilians get their preferences from. And I kept looking for a book that told me about the civilian role in civ-mil relations and was startled not to be able to find it. And you know what they say, if you can't find the book, you're the sucker who has to write it. So I have written it. So, where do you go? I mean, honestly, you go to history and biography. You can go to Peter's book. Peter's book is great, and it really helps you think through sort of the game theoretic approach, the structural approach. He uses principal agent theory famously. It makes you as a civilian think through the relationship as a strategic one, right? Where your actions depend on the actions you expect from the other side of the equation. But I still found that so much of our literature, and even Peter's, really measures civilian control based on what the military does. And we don't have a lot of playbooks for what does it look like when civilians exercise control? How do they do that? And so I went back to Title 10, which is a pretty good source. I went back to the NDAA, which has, pieces here and there over the years. And then I also went back to the history of the consolidation and centralization of the military services in the National Security Act of 1947, because there was a lot of great debate that's been captured on the Hill and between the Hill and the executive branch on what should this look like? What do we want a Secretary of Defense to do? What does civilian control look like inside the executive branch? And what's the division of labor between the executive and the legislative, right? So I've tried to cobble all that together and give a sense of who are civilians. Ron's point was excellent. If the listeners could have seen, I did a little dance when he said there's all kinds of civilians, because that's exactly right. There are politicians, there are administrators, and there are bureaucrats, right? But there's also executive politician, the president, and there's legislative politicians, right? And they're different from each other, and they have different incentives and constraints imposed on them. And so that's the kind of thing I've been thinking through is, think about what kind of civilian you're talking about. What are the incentives? Those incentives electoral or professional or political? And then think about what their actual responsibilities and obligations and authorities are. So normative obligations, but also legal responsibilities and authorities to the military. And that's, that starts to build you a picture. But today there's nowhere one good source, right? A civilian that goes into these roles has to really sort of take on a research project to cobble all this stuff together. So hopefully someday soon, I'll be able to offer this to the world.
Yeah, I really love that article. And one of the things I admire about your approach is that so often people don't consider the National Security Act of 1947, for example, as a civil military relations document. Oh, it's bureaucratic, it's organizational. No, it is foundational to American civil military relations. And I really appreciate the way that you go through and derive the legal authorities and work forward from them. But you also discussed the electoral incentives. And Ron, you started to get at this a little bit as you were discussing this question of whether or not Americans care about this fundamental aspect of democracy. And so I guess my question, building off of Alice's work, is how do you make that have force in a world where the deciding factor in an election is the cost of gasoline?
What's I think really fascinating, right? All of us, throughout our adult lives, have lived in an environment in which we romanticize and idealize the military. And there has been now a great deal of research, none of which I have done, which shows the ways in which there are real advantages to that, right? That there are sort of, draping yourself with the mantle of the military has certain kinds of consequences. And certainly primes people in particular ways, and certainly opposing the military is not to your political advantage. What's been really striking to me since June of 2020 has been exactly the opposite, something that we have not seen outside of the far left in a very long time, which has been the denigration of senior military officers. We've gone from Trump, cloaking himself in the mantle of my generals to claims of the woke military, and to Matt Gaetz and Ted Cruz suggesting that, it's because of people like Mark Milley that we're losing on the battlefield. It's been a really remarkable transformation. When's the last time we saw anybody on the political right do that? And it's a really interesting, what's the politics that lies behind that? Because in fact, many of our theories would have led, and much of these other research would have led us to expect that these folks, this should be kind of political kryptonite. This is the third rail of American politics. And yet that certainly does not appear to have been the case. And we've had multiple episodes in which senior military officers have been placed in the crosshairs, with a clear distinction being drawn between the senior military and the rank and file, right? The argument being they are corrupt, the generals. They're the ones who are getting in the way. They're the ones who are sending you into these unnecessary wars. I, the populist, I am with you and you are with me. We are all one, you, the rank and file. So I think that we have to actually rethink some of our understanding of the politics of the military based on what we've observed in the last couple of years.
Risa, I'm curious about your thoughts on that, and particularly if you have any insight on whether and how other countries have dealt with this.
Well, I think I'll just start with this, that we tend to view all of these things as exceptional. And I would say they're mostly business as usual throughout history and in many other parts of the world. I mean, I'm a critic of Huntington, but he also had his objective control idea, but his subjective control idea, the idea that one wants to remake the military in your own likeness, is a really prevalent dynamic historically, and the sort of politicization that we're seeing, the pressures being put to produce an illicit conformity or alignment with a particular political faction, I think are not unusual at all. My worry is that the U.S. military hasn't experienced that, at least recently in its history, and doesn't have a good playbook for how to respond to that, and that the civilians who are also worried and watching that are caught in what I see as sort of a dilemma of their own kind, which is that they want to, I'll include myself in this, want to ensure that regular democratic processes and norms prevail, which is to encourage the military to stay in its lane and to abide by traditional norms, and to enforce those norms by, say, critiquing President Biden for putting Marines behind him during a democracy speech. But that we are so in such a moment that even efforts to try to enforce norms, to ensure that democratic politics continues as we like it, can be weaponized and misused and contorted in this effort to politicize the military and to elicit a political faction. And so I think it's just an incredibly fraught moment, as there's so many pieces of American politics, and I don't see that there are a lot of clear paths forward for either the civilians that recognize the problem and the military who are subject to it.
So Since we've outlined a relatively clear and simple playing field thus far with obvious solution sets, let me complicate things a little bit by throwing in the question of veterans and retirees. These people who hold a simultaneous status as civilians and military. They continue to wear the cloak of service, while at the same time they lack the institutional control and levers that are placed on members of the military. This can take the form of so-called vet bro culture, folks who wear their service, brandish their service as a qualification for their political viewpoints and citizenship in their view. It can take the perspective of the challenges that arise when we place a retired military officer such as Austin or Mattis into a senior civilian position as Secretary of Defense. It can arise when a figure who uses their rank as their principal qualification goes on to assume a prominent place politically, such as Michael Flynn, the former National Security Advisor, who is more often identified as a retired lieutenant general. We already work in a world where we are dealing principally with norms, not with rules and laws, not with things that can be enforced in some way. How do we manage these incredibly challenging questions of civil-military relations when we have these people who lack the mechanisms of institutional control and yet profoundly influence the interaction and dynamic that occurs? Ron, I'll let you answer that first, since it's a relatively simple one.
Thanks so much, Doyle. That's so kind of you. One thing that I was struck by in some of my research, and I'm going to answer your question a little indirectly, was how little the public grasps a meaningful distinction between retired and active duty military officers. We asked people, amongst other questions, what role should active duty, and we asked separately about retired military officers, have in public debates over policy in the military domain, outside the military domain. And there were never really significant differences in how people responded to that. They thought they should be much more involved in public debates as active duty military officers than Huntingtonian theory would suggest that they should. But they didn't really seem to care. The numbers didn't change dramatically when we asked about retired military officers. Now, at one level, that was pretty disturbing, right? But it sort of led me to reflect on the fact that maybe they shouldn't draw really meaningful distinctions between the two. The fact is that those who are retired, when they engage in these public debates, they speak on the basis of military authority. They are parlaying their military experience. They have ongoing and overlapping social networks. It's not like they leave the military and they have no idea what's going on within the military. They have lots of active duty friends and mentees and acolytes who continue to serve. They carry remarkable weight in public debate, and thus one can argue pervert democratic deliberation in a variety of ways. But as you noted, Doyle, this is not only is this not subject to rules and norms, it isn't really about institutions. One thing that we have learned is that democracy is actually pretty fragile. That at the end of the day, all of those institutions and norms only work insofar as people are prepared to play by them. And if people don't want to play by those rules, our institutions are much more fragile than we sort of like to think that they are. And so at the end of the day, we might say, all of this is hortatory. Aren't we just encouraging people to do the right thing? Well, that is, to go back to sort of the best named judge of all time, the Judge Learned Hand during the Second World War, the federal judge, who says, ultimately, to use his gendered language, liberty lies in the hearts of men. And when liberty dies, to paraphrase him, when liberty dies there, right, it cannot survive. It does not reside in institutions.
Yeah, so I came up with this idea in the midst of Ron talking, and what he just said maybe overrides what I'm about to say, but I'll throw it out there anyway, which is, Doyle, you said we don't have institutional controls for these things, and I want to push back on that. Because we do. We have political parties, we have the confirmation process, we have the military services themselves, right? There's no panacea to reinforcing the norms around veterans and how they talk about their military service and their rank when they're involved in partisan politics. But, if you still have your commission, which senior retired officers usually retain, right, then you are still under the UCMJ, right? And the UCMJ has rules about this. Moreover, there's professional standards that you can be. The confirmation process, right? We've twice the idea that under Title 10, now it's 10 years again, but for the last 2 rounds, it was 7 years. 7 years have to separate a general or flag officer from retirement and his or her service as Secretary of Defense. But both those individuals made it through the confirmation process, right? So we considered that rule and decided to make exceptions in those 2 cases, rightly or wrongly, right? And then political parties are the ones that could be imposing standards on themselves and their candidates over whether or not they, for example, send out fundraising emails that are from, Admiral so-and-so. And I don't care how many times you stamp on Admiral so-and-so's fundraising email that this is not endorsed by DOD, you're still using his rank for him to run for a partisan political office and ask for partisan support. So there are institutional checks, but to Ron's point, we have to decide to use them. If we decide not to use them, then these aren't norms anymore, right? They're dead. We've decided we don't care.
Yeah. The one other thing I would mention there regarding the retaining the commission, and I was actually somewhat surprised to learn this, is that reserve officers who are retired are an exception, that reserve retired officers are no longer subject to the authority of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. An active duty officer who is retired is a reserve officer who is not. And we could do, and actually it'd be kind of interesting to do an entire separate podcast on the dual roles and the blending of roles between reservists, especially reservists serving in the legislative branch. There's just a fascinating set of things there. And the National Guard brings in a whole bunch of other interesting possibilities. But Risa, I'm really curious as to your thoughts on this as well.
So do you want my normal answer or my answer informed by some of the thinking of my colleagues and by the current issues of the day? Maybe I'll just give you both. My normal answer is retired officers should keep their mouths shut because it's not helpful on a whole lot of dimensions. It supplants civilian voices and civilian expertise. It is, signaling to the public that it's appropriate, especially given that they don't discriminate between retired and active. It's appropriate to comment on various issues, and that generally democratic politics work better if the military isn't acting like an interest group in this capacity. My answer for the day is that I'm wondering if there's an exception to this. I'm persuaded by some commentaries that suggest that pro-democracy dissent is somewhat different. And the reason, this is my own thinking, the reason it may be is that the U.S. military is not a value-neutral organization. It is an organization whose members take an oath to a constitution that embodies particular values, including democracy. And therefore, speaking up and supporting that democracy is consistent with the professional ethic. Now, how and in which way someone does that, I think matters. Those details are not just details. But in this day and age, when there are affronts and efforts to sort of compromise, you have Scheller on podcast talking about how the U.S. military should not teach international law and respect human rights. And that's coming from different things. There's such an affront in so many different ways on democratic values, including in the military. Is there not a place for that kind of dissent? I don't know, but it's something that I'm grappling with because I don't want all of us, including myself, including members of the military, to sit by and sort of hold on to our norms as these precious things while the ship sinks around us. And so I pose that not as an answer, but as that's something that I'm grappling with, and I'm worried about that we're unprepared for dealing with these challenges. So,
no, I think you framed it really nicely, and I think it's one of the challenges. Norms, and this is going to sound almost trivial, but norms are inherently normative, and the idea that institutionally I want someone to speak up in certain circumstances can run up on a stumbling block on that because institutional checks are not normative. So if I'm going to speak of a limit on an institutional role, for instance, a limit on the role of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, I've got to ask myself, what would Michael Flynn do? Because if I'm not satisfied that I would be comfortable with someone whose views I disagree with using the full authority granted to them by the position, then I don't want that authority granted to the position. But on the normative side, then the question is, how do we incentivize those norms to have power? Ron, you had your hand up.
Yeah, although I'm really disturbed, I'm still getting over the WWMFD and sort of, just what would Michael Flynn do? That is not a question I typically wish to ask myself. Can't unthink that one now. I want to sort of echo and then complicate where Risa just took us, because that, I think, speaks to what really makes this, as she put it earlier, such a fraught moment. We might like to say, yes, right, there is a role for the military in upholding the system. And of course, that's what this letter does. It's CivMil 101, but it's also Democracy 101. Right? And in that sense, right, it's only a good thing, as is precisely because those basic democratic norms and principles are in the crosshairs, and how, as authoritarian an institution as the military fits into a democracy, I think is something that we need to be reminded of. But as Risa suggested, in an environment in which what we even understand to be a pro-systemic intervention, right, which I think, Risa, what you're talking about, an intervention on behalf of the system. That's what that letter articulated. We are there to defend the Constitution, the institutions as they stand. What it didn't say is the military is also fundamentally, therefore, a conservative, a status quo institution, right? In a way that, frankly, civilians don't have to be. They did have one profound misstep in this letter, which I think revealed something about what happens when people who are in the military. They wrote in their letter, right, all civilians are likewise obligated to support and defend the Constitution as their highest duty. That's not true. We citizens are not obligated to do so. We must obey the Constitution, but we have every democratic right to seek to effect change, to amend our Constitution, right? That is, in fact, also our democratic responsibility. And that is very much within our rights and responsibilities as democratic citizens. So in that sense, I think the question is, when in an environment that is so intensely politically polarized, how do we understand pro-systemic intervention? What is obviously to Risa, or perhaps to Alice and me and you, what is understood to be a pro-systemic intervention may not be, and I think almost certainly will not be understood as such by those on the other side. There is no agreement, as much as, I'll put my own cards on the table, as much as the kinds of various measures that have been going across state houses seem to me to be obviously limiting access to democracy, and therefore we should oppose them as anti-systemic measures because we are on behalf of the system. They're obviously not understood as such by those who are promoting those measures, and they make profoundly arguments for legitimated in the language of democracy and ensuring democratic electoral security and so on behalf of those very laws that have been passed across.
So Risa, you had a two finger on that one.
Yeah, and I guess I just want to reframe what would Michael Flynn do as what I think of as the Pandora's box problem. Once you get folks speaking out on issues in ways that you agree with, you also sort of enable people to speak out on stuff that you don't agree with. And that is the fundamental, a really practical, if not, basis for having norms of keeping the military out of politics, because that's divisive in terms of democratic politics within the civilian sphere, but it's also bad for the military too. The one thing I would say, though, sort of as I was reflecting, listening, is that there is something, because we're talking about like what can be done, or it's something I'm worried about. One thing that I think the military can do is affirm its own values, which is that it does support, it takes an oath to a constitution, and most people, including articles by Paula Thornhill in War on the Rocks, within the military who outlines this, don't always understand the meaning of that oath and the meaning of the document, the Constitution. So working on and not shying away from the fact that that is the commitment. And while there are efforts to distort that, purposeful efforts by certain actors, that that's a really core thing that is a constructive thing that's consistent with the values that can be affirmed by senior leadership, by civilians, and, sort of demonstrated to the public a bit more, I think.
Alice, you had a hand up.
Yeah, I think part of what we're getting after too here is that, how policy bleeds into politics, which bleeds into partisanship, and there aren't really bright lines between those things. We know that there are distinctions between them and they are different things, but it is hard to know in the practice of it when a debate is over values and when it's become, because politics is about what we value. It's about what are we going to prioritize and put resources towards, right? It's how are we going to make these decisions? And so I think I've been thinking a lot about, what's happened recently in the Army with the IG investigation that was reported on for Major General, right, Patrick Donahoe, and his sort of interaction on Twitter with some partisan voices, in the ecosystem. And, the argument is that he was just upholding Army values, right? He was supporting soldiers and supporting sort of the personnel policy of the United States Army, right? And so, there's a counter argument that's like, yeah, but doing so, he did it in a really political way, or well, actually, personnel policy itself can become really partisan, right? This bleeds into is the military too woke? And it's so hard to know, I think it's very hard for the Secretary of the Army, for example, to know how to police that, right? How does she draw the line between, and how does the IG, for that matter, draw the line between a uniformed officer engaging in speech that is upholding a policy, but doing so in a partisan context, for example? And when is upholding a policy itself also partisan, right? Kind of getting after figuring out where that line is, I think is what we're just struggling with mightily right now, because it's really unclear. But that's what we need to figure out.
But Alice, as the Secretary of the Army, she's supposed to be political, according to more. So it's different for her to affirm. It's not, than what he did, right? You're making that distinction, yes,
right? But as the Secretary of the Army, then she has the authority to discipline him, right? So how does she make that decision? So absolutely, I think she should be able to jump in and have these debates, right? So that the folks in uniform don't have to, 100%. But then, where does she draw the line for their engagement? I think that's like really the kernel of it right now in the civ-mil relationship, at least on the executive side.
Yeah, and that can raise special challenges when the executive and the legislative are under the control of different parties. And then especially recently with the role of the judiciary in overturning things. And I think here of the recent Pentagon decision about funding travel for service members who are seeking an abortion, but it is not permitted in their state in the wake of the Dobbs decision. And it's easy for that to be perceived as the military taking a partisan political stance. But because of the federal system of government wherein I have differing positions on a divisive issue among different states and a lack of federal law governing it, it is actually what the military is required to do in order to provide equitable health care to service members. And there's almost no way to do that can't be interpreted in a partisan light. It's a particularly challenging set of issues that are confronted there. It's a good sign about the richness of the discussion we've been having that we've already run over the time that we had allotted, and that I still have a list of questions I would absolutely love to get to. So I think what I'm taking from that is that we need to get together for part 2 of this conversation at some point in the future. But for now, I'd like to ask each of you to take 30 seconds, and honestly, no kidding, 30 seconds, and highlight for us what you think the most critical takeaway is, either from the letter or the issues we've brought up in the course of our discussion today. And Ron, I'll start with you, then go to Risa, and Alice, you'll get the final word.
All right. Mine will be about how we talk about the military and how we position the military within our culture. Changing our discourse about the professional military turning away from that romanticization and idealization of the military and figuring out how do we do that in a way that doesn't yield, right, the opposite extreme of denigration, right? So finding our way between deference and denigration. And in a word which has often been lost from our social scientific vocabularies, how do we go about combating militarism in that sense, right? That's what I understand to be militarism, which is not good for democracy, not good for foreign policy and national security, and frankly, not good for soldiers themselves.
Risa.
I would say so far, the professional norms have held. The military has not, by and large, the active force responded to these efforts to elicit a political faction within the officer corps. That is really important to maintain. And so I would suggest to folks in the military today, to the senior leadership, make sure your house is in order. Make sure that everyone understands that in the event of a contested election, writing op-eds, talking about how you might believe one side or another is probably not a good idea. And that, or worse, if there's efforts to draw the military into particular engagement in elections or various shenanigans, that it's really important that that house is in order and that they're prepared for that and that they keep maintaining the military from getting involved in those kinds of scenarios.
So I think we civilians have to back the military out of domestic partisan politics. So scholars in democracy are warning us that we're trending toward more political violence. And as soon as politics get to be steadily violent, then everyone wants to have the experts in violence on their side. We don't want those experts to feel they should or have to choose sides. So we need to be doing the work today to get those experts out of our partisan battles and leave that to civilians. And then after that, we need to get our partisan battles to a much healthier place.
Yeah, I think that's an absolutely key element, is to create a political environment in which the recourse to violence is regarded as extraordinary and illegitimate rather than as an element of the political environment that we exist in. I got to say, I have enjoyed and learned from this conversation tremendously. I would like to thank Risa and Ron and Alice. And like I said, don't be surprised if I am bugging you to do a second round of this, because, boy, the realm of rich and important questions that we didn't have time to get to is just enormous. So thanks very much for your time.
Thanks for having us, Doyle.
Thanks a lot, Doyle. It was fun.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma. And please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.